Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you for this special webinar on Corona Financial Crisis, Is This Time Different? By Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao, former Governor, RBI, organized by the CFA Institute. My name is Samiran Chakraborty. I am the Chief Economist India for Citibank. This is my pleasure to welcome all of you for this call. The world economy is witnessing a once-in-a-century event as policymakers around the world are grappling with the ideal response to a shock which comes primarily from the supply side, but threatens to morph into a demand side one quickly. The health crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and the economic crisis often seem to have solutions which are counterproductive to each other. While we pass through this dark and uncertain period, it is natural to look back at other crisis episodes to take inspiration about how to deal with this one. And who better to take you through this than former RBI Governor Dr. Subbarao, who had steered the economy through the global financial crisis of 2008-9 and also the taper tantrum period of 2013. I can assure you that at this moment, there is no better way to spend your Sunday afternoon than to get immersed into his immense experience and insights. Dr. Subbarao is going to share his thoughts for about 30 minutes, and then you will also have an opportunity to ask him questions at the end of his talk. At this moment, let me provide a brief introduction to you about Dr. Subbarao, although I'm pretty sure that all of you are very familiar with him in your professional interactions. Dr. Subbarao served as Governor of the Reserve Bank of India for 5 years, finishing his term in 2013. Dr. Subbarao also served as Finance Secretary to the Government of India, Secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and lead economist at the World Bank. Earlier in his career, he served as a career civil servant in the Indian Administrative Service, where he worked in various positions in the state government of Andhra Pradesh and in the Indian federal government. Dr. Subbarao received a BSc Honours in Physics from IIT Kharagpur, an MS in Physics from IIT Kanpur, and an MS in Economics from Ohio State University. He later studied public finance as a Humphrey Fellow at MIT and earned a PhD in Economics from Andhra University. After stepping down from the RBI, Dr. Subbarao was a Distinguished Visiting Fellow, first at the National University of Singapore and later at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Subbarao, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samiran, and good evening to all of you. It's wonderful to be speaking to all of you this Sunday evening, although it's a very strange experience. I hope all of you are safe and healthy and are keeping social distance and are washing your hands regularly. First, I want to spend 1 minute giving you a big picture. What started as a regional epidemic in China has snowballed into a global pandemic in just a matter of 3 months. Hundreds of millions of people in hundreds of countries are under threat. The global economy is plunging into a downturn, which could be as grave as the Great Depression. Governments have ordered the most extensive lockdowns in history. Virtually every country in the world is affected by the crisis. There is fear, there is uncertainty about what's going to happen. That's exacerbated by the fear of the unknown. There's anxiety about how the crisis might unfold, where it will take us, what sort of a world it will leave us in. So before I talk about the subject, now I want to conduct a thought experiment with all of you. We are all going through a very, very strange experience at a personal level. Every crisis in history has brought about fundamental shifts in societal attitudes, in community patterns, in households, lifestyles, in individual values and beliefs. So I want you to think, when you go back after this session, when this crisis is behind us, 3 ways in which your life might change as a result of this crisis. Now let me get to the topic. As Samiran said, the corona crisis is leading to a financial crisis. We'll call it the corona financial crisis, CFC. It's natural at this time to go back to the global financial crisis, DFC. So what I'm going to do is to address three specific issues. What is similar and what is different between the global financial crisis of 2008 and the corona financial crisis of 2020. Then I'm going to move on to India's response to COVID-19 briefly. And finally, I'll talk about the lessons of the crisis. So first about what is similar and what is different at the global level. The origin and transmission of the crisis is different. The global financial crisis was a consequence of risk-taking in the financial sector, excessive risk. It is a consequence of reckless financial engineering. It originated in the financial sector and then contaminated the real sector through demand destruction. The corona financial crisis, on the other hand, is a consequence of a disease. It originated in the real sector and is transmitted to the financial sector, first through the supply channels because the China-centered supply channels broke down, and then quite independently through the demand channels. So the GFC originated in the financial sector and transmitted to the real economy. The CFC originated in the real economy and is transmitted to the financial sector. This is not just an academic distinction I'm making, it has important implications for the nature and effectiveness of the solutions. In particular, I'm going to talk about two differences it makes to the solutions. First, the GFC, during the global financial crisis, faith in the financial system was broken. There was a financial constraint to work. Demand was destroyed as a consequence. Supply shrank as a consequence of demand shrinking. In the present corona financial crisis, confidence in the real economy is broken. There's a real constraint to work. The initial impact was through the supply channel when the China-centered supply channels broke down. And then quite independently of the supply channels, the demand channels broke down. So during the GFC, demand collapsed and that dragged down supply. During the current CFC, supply is broken down and demand is broken down quite independently. So what does that mean for the solution? During the GFC, global financial crisis, it is important that the thrust of the solution was to inspire confidence in the financial sector. The calculation was that if the financial sector is repaired, demand will revive and supply will come back as a consequence. Now, during the corona financial crisis, the thrust of the solution has to be to inspire confidence in the real economy that the pandemic is under control. That will revive supply, and as a consequence, it will revive demand. So, during the GFC, we had to work on the financial sector and fixing demand. During the CFC, we had to work on the real economy and fix supply. There's another difference this makes to the nature and effectiveness of the solution. During the global financial crisis, you might recall the epicenter of the crisis were the systemically important countries, US and Europe. So it is very important that financial stability was restored first in Europe, in the US and then Europe, and that after a lag would transmit to the rest of the world. In other words, restoring financial stability in America, in Europe, was a necessary and to a large extent sufficient condition for restoring financial stability everywhere. The situation during the corona financial crisis right now is quite different. Each country is trying to fight the crisis within its borders. Each country will bring the disease under control within its borders. But that is not sufficient, because even if a country brings the disease under control within its borders, it could always come back from another country. For example, rich countries like the US and Europe are not safe until poor countries are safe. No country in the world is safe until every country in the world is safe. So that's another important distinction between the GFC and the CFC. The second thing is about the nature and depth of uncertainty. Uncertainty is a defining feature of every crisis. During the global financial crisis, for example, you will recall, there was a whole lot of uncertainty about how much risk there was in the system, where the risk was residing, who was bearing the risk. For us in India, for us in the Reserve Bank, there was a lot of uncertainty. I'll just give you one example. Storied financial institutions around the world were falling day after day. So our responsibility, our task, our mandate was to inspire confidence in the financial markets in India. So we were sending the message that our financial system is safe and sound, there was nothing to worry. But there was a whole lot of uncertainty about how far markets will trust us, how long markets will trust us. Similarly, there is a lot of uncertainty in the corona financial crisis now. But the level of uncertainty, the quantum of uncertainty is much deeper. There are just too many known unknowns, not to speak of unknown unknowns. We just don't know enough, for example, about how effective are the lockdowns. What is the age and gender profile of susceptibility to the disease? What is the process of recovery? Is there a tipping point when we will have mass immunity? Will the disease come back in waves? And if the disease comes back in waves, how do we handle that? And most importantly, when, if at all, will we have a vaccine and a cure? So because of the extent of uncertainty, governments are perforce having to fly blind. So that's the second difference between the GFC and the CFC. The third is about the tensions and trade-offs in crisis solutions. During the global financial crisis, the solution to the real economy and the solution to the financial sector worked in tandem, they reinforced each other. During the global financial crisis now, solutions to the real economy and solutions to the financial sector are working against each other. Let me explain. During the global financial crisis, in America, for example, in the real economy, they had a program like TARP, you might recall, Troubled Assets Reconstruction Program, which was meant to infuse capital into firms. On the financial side, the Federal Reserve was cutting rates, doing quantitative easing, doing dollar swaps, etc. But the solutions in the real economy and solutions in the financial sector, they reinforced each other. But today, look at the global corona financial crisis. In the real economy, we're working on stringent lockdowns. Stringent lockdowns restrain the spread of the disease, but that comes at a huge economic cost. That comes at the cost of deepening the financial pain. So all growth drivers, consumption, production, they're slumping, and eventually they might collapse. On the other hand, if governments try to control or contain the economic impact, they risk losing lives to the disease, to the coronavirus. So you see that there is a conflict between solutions that we are implementing in the real economy and solutions in the financial sector. So the summary point is that during the global financial crisis, the real economy solutions and the financial sector solutions reinforced each other. During the corona financial crisis, they're working against each other. The fourth issue, difference between the GFC and the CFC, is global cooperation. Global cooperation was the hallmark of attacking the global financial crisis. Global leaders showed extraordinary leadership. The G20 came together. When the history of the GFC is written, the London G20 meeting, April 2009, will be looked as the single event to turn the crisis around because the G20 leaders met. They agreed that there'll be a coordinated stimulus. They agreed that there'll be coordinated monetary policy easing. They agreed that there'll be no protectionism. This time round, there is no global cooperation to speak of. There was, of course, a G20 meeting that was more like a pro forma meeting. There is, in fact, a lot of bitterness between countries. There was already bitterness before the corona financial crisis because of the trade wars. That bitterness has intensified because of the CFC. But what's happening, though, is that even if there is no global cooperation across countries as nation states, there is considerable cooperation, I read somewhere, between scientific establishments around the world, cutting across political divides, cutting across wealth divides, cutting across geographic divides. They are doing scientific research together under a crowdsourcing model to identify a vaccine and to discover a cure for the disease, and that's very heartening. And the final thing, the final difference between the GFC and the CFC is about the shape of recovery. There is, in the literature, there's different shapes of recovery. They in fact draw from the alphabet. There's a V-shaped recovery, there's a U-shaped recovery, there's a W-shaped recovery, etc. Over the last 25 years, for every recession, we've had a V-shaped recovery, which meant that we got into the depth of the crisis fairly rapidly, but came out fairly rapidly as well. The sole exception to the V-shaped recovery was the global financial crisis for 2008-9, when we had a U-shaped recovery, especially in the rich countries. They got into the crisis fairly quickly, but they've taken a very, very long time to get out of it. In fact, there's consensus that they have not truly come out of the crisis. What about the corona financial crisis? What sort of a recovery will it be? The original thinking was that it'll be a V-shaped recovery, that as soon as the pandemic is brought under control, the supply side will open up and the demand side will open up. As a consequence, the world will open up, come out of lockdown, and we'll have a V-shaped recovery. That confidence that the world showed about a month ago is rapidly evaporated. Today, we don't know whether we have a V-shaped recovery, as I said, because there's just too much of uncertainty, there's too many known unknowns. So we could have a V-shaped recovery, we could have a U-shaped recovery, in fact, we could have a W-shaped recovery. If in fact, the pandemic comes back in waves, as is the fear right now, we could have a W-shaped recovery. So those are the 5 important differences between the global financial crisis and the CFC. So that's at the global level. What about the India level? India's macroeconomics, as all of us know, in 2020, as we are hit by the CFC, are much weaker than in 2008 when we were hit by the global financial crisis. In particular, in every macroeconomic variable, we are much weaker today. Growth, for example, in 2008, remember, just before the global financial crisis, the India growth story was unraveling. The growth was at its highest level before we were hit by the GFC. We were growing at 9 to 9.5%. In contrast today, during the corona financial crisis, we entered the crisis with a growth slump. Similarly, the financial sector. Our financial sector was safe and sound as we were hit by the GFC in 2008. In fact, it was safe enough to withstand the global convulsions. Today, our financial sector is stressed. NPAs are growing, and they'll grow even much more because of the CFC. and we're not even sure whether the financial sector will be resilient enough to withstand all the shocks. Then fiscal. When we entered the GFC in 2008, our fiscal was in a reasonably good shape. There was enough fiscal room for a stimulus. Today, our fiscal is overstretched. The analysts are saying that even without any stimulus, the combined fiscal deficit of the center and states will be an unprecedented over 10% of GDP. Monetary policy. Monetary headroom arguably was much more in 2008 than today in 2020. The only dimension in which today we are reasonably better than in 2008 is the external sector, because we have credible, robust foreign exchange reserves of about $470 billion. So that's the first thing. To bring you back to where I am, I've spoken so far about the first bullet, what is similar and what is different between the GFC and the CFC at the global level and at the India level. So let me now move on to India's response to COVID-19. India ordered a lockdown, fortunately, at an earlier point of the transmission curve than most other countries. That should give us a relative advantage in reducing the pandemic from a raging fire to a slow burn. Shortly after the lockdown was ordered on March 24, the government came out with a fiscal package to provide livelihood support to the urban informal sector and to the rural sector of about 0.8% of GDP. There's been a lot of criticism that this is not enough, this is too little. 2 days after the government's fiscal package, the Reserve Bank came out with its monetary and regulatory package. The Reserve Bank did three things in particular. Because the private sector, businesses, firms, and households cannot pay because of liquidity constraints, they ordered a moratorium for 3 months. That loans and interest need not be repaid for 3 months. But because of this non-payment, banks will come under pressure. They've made liquidity available to banks by cutting CRR, by allowing more money available to them through the MSF window. And the third thing they did was to encourage lending. They cut the repo rate, they cut the reverse repo rate, and they've had this targeted long-term repo operations. So in order for the banks to buy commercial bonds. So the Reserve Bank has worked on three things, which is to give relief to borrowers, give relief to banks, and to encourage banks to spend, or to lend, excuse me. Those are things that have been done. But looking ahead, there's two things. The first thing is what everybody's talking about, this dilemma or tension between saving lives and saving livelihoods. I don't know how many of you remember that 1982 movie, Sophie's Choice. It was a very acclaimed movie. Meryl Streep got an Oscar for the best leading actress for that movie. Sophie's Choice is about Sophie, who is a Polish Jew who was taken to a concentration camp, and she had two children. She had to decide which of her two children will go to the gas chamber and which of her two children will go to the labor camp. So governments today are having something like the Sophie's Choice. If they have to save lives, in order to save lives, they have to extend the lockdown. But the longer they extend the lockdown, the more they push the informal sector to the margins of subsistence. On the other hand, if they try to contain the economic impact of the lockdown, they will run the risk of exposing more lives to the disease. So no matter how the government decides, they have to manage this dilemma between saving lives and saving livelihoods. But in any case, whatever be the decision, the government will have to spend more. Spend more on three things: on improving and expanding medical infrastructure. Second, they have to spend more on supporting livelihoods. And third, they have to spend more on stimulating the economy after some normalcy is restored. So there is this big issue about how much the government can spend given all the fiscal constraints. I will not go into the details of that, but that's an issue that we must flag. So I've spoken about the similarities and differences. I've spoken about India's response to COVID-19. Let me now spend the last 10 minutes of my time talking about the lessons of the crisis. I will, in particular, compare between the GFC and the CFC. The first lesson from the crisis is that as much as we learn from other countries, we have to take our own decision. During crisis times, there is enormous pressure on governments, on central banks to do what other countries are doing. For example, today, most countries in the world have ordered lockdowns. Some have ordered full lockdowns, some have ordered partial lockdowns, some have ordered lockdowns in phases, some have ordered lockdowns in different geographies. In some countries like Sweden, Brazil have no lockdowns at all. But we in India have to tailor our own lockdown to our circumstances, to the evolution of the disease in our country, to our population density, to the depth of our medical infrastructure, our balance between lives and livelihoods. So as much as we learn from other countries, we have to tailor the solution to our own situation. Similarly, take the fiscal support. People say America is doing 8% of GDP, Britain is doing 10% of GDP, Malaysia is doing 12% of GDP. But we have to decide how much we can spend depending on our own fiscal constraints. In fact, we had lots of issues like this even during the global financial crisis. There was a lot of pressure from the public, from the markets, from the media, from the analysts for us to do things that other countries are doing. But we had to study each measure that other countries are doing and adapt that to our own situation. I have lots of examples, but I don't have the time, but during the discussion, we can talk about it if you choose. The second thing is that exit has to be carefully planned because mistakes can be costly. I'm fond of taking an analogy from Mahabharata. All of you remember the story of Abhimanyu and the Chakraborty. Getting into the Chakraborty is easy, but getting out is difficult. In fact, Abhimanyu had to sacrifice his life because he did not know how to get out. Similarly, during a crisis, it's relatively easy to initiate solutions, but extremely difficult to get out. During a crisis, for example, central banks and governments, for large part, play the percentage game, which is that they do whatever is they believe will have the best result. Some will produce positive results, some will not have a result, but they do whatever they think will be necessary. But during a crisis, during exit, we have to be extremely careful. Remember after the GFC, global financial crisis, how much of deliberation, how much of agitation, how much of anxiety there was about withdrawing from the crisis-prevent easy policies. Remember a taper tantrum when Ben Bernanke said that we will taper the quantitative easing, financial markets around the world were shaken. So we have to be extremely careful today about managing the exit. There are many questions, for example. When do we lift the lockdown? Once we lift the lockdown, what sort of gradual phasing out we have to do? What will be the gradual phasing out of the preventive measures? How do we restart the economy? How do we ensure that demand and supply grow in tandem? So we have to manage all this as we exit from the crisis. The third thing is communication. Communication and consultation are key. And how you say is as important as what you say. During the global financial crisis, communication has emerged as a very, very important policy tool for central banks. In fact, there's been so much written about how communication has become an effective policy tool. Remember, the Federal Reserve in the US used to say repeatedly that we will maintain the extraordinary easy policy for an extended period of time. They kept saying it, kept saying it, kept saying it, because they wanted to communicate that message very forcefully. Remember again, Mario Draghi, president of the ECB, during the depth of the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, he used those famous three words, we will save the euro, whatever it takes. Those three words saved the euro more than anything else that happened during the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. So communication is very important. And what's important in communication is to honestly convey the situation as it is, but at the same time be reassuring. Let me give you an example. Today there is, for example, a lot of debate about whether there is community transmission in India. So health authorities, political leaders, Prime Minister, Chief Minister, senior civil servants, all of them have to tell us honestly to what extent, if there is any community transmission, so that we can take our precautions. But at the same time, they should convey reassurance that we should not be panicking because of the community transmission, and what preventive measures they're taking and what preventive measures we should be taking. You know, there's a lot of praise for the governor of New York State, Maria Cuomo, for what he's doing, how carefully he's communicating honestly the situation, how honestly he's saying what he does not know, but at the same time, how sincerely he's communicating reassurance, communicating sympathy, and communicating empathy. So communication is a very, very important thing during a crisis. The fourth thing is, even as the short term is compelling, don't ignore the long term, in spite of what Keynes said, which is that in the long term we're all dead, in the long term we're not all dead. In every public policy decision, there is a tension between short-term compulsions and long-term sustainability. Typically, short-term compulsions compromise long-term sustainability, and the challenge for decision makers is to manage this tension between the short-term and the long-term. That tension becomes particularly acute during a crisis. For example, today, the Federal Reserve has unleashed so much of quantitative easing. It's, instead of being just the lender of last resort, it's become commercial bank of last resort to businesses. The Bank of England has entered into an agreement with the Treasury to do central bank financing of the government debt. There is worldwide concern about how cell phones are being tracked, the cell phones are being used for contact tracing. So governments and authorities are tracking movements on the cell phone. But all these measures that I have just given, all the examples, there are concerns about what happens after the crisis. The measures taken by the Federal Reserve during the crisis, will they get institutionalized? Measures taken by the Bank of England, whether that will become routine for the central bank to lend directly to the government. The surveillance through the cell phones, contact tracing, will that become an instrument for surveillance? And if indeed it becomes an instrument for surveillance, how will it change our lives? So that's another important difference or lesson of the crisis. Finally, we must allow creative destruction. Our criticism during the global financial crisis or in the aftermath of that was that in advanced economies, as well as in some other emerging economies, we tried to save every financial institution, even if it came at an enormous cost, with the result that a lot of zombie institutions were left intact, whereas they should have been allowed to die. A crisis is an opportunity to allow, it's an opportunity for creative destruction when weak institutions should be allowed to die so that strong institutions emerge in their wake. I said earlier that the government should do a lot of things by way of restarting the economy, by way of providing livelihoods to the informal sector, to the rural sector, by way of providing cash support to businesses, by way of providing stimulus. All that is necessary, but there are limits to doing that. There is a lot of restructuring to be done. But even as we're doing some restructuring, we should make sure that it's only illiquid institutions and not insolvent institutions that are supported. In other words, we must support illiquid institutions, but allow insolvent institutions to die. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. I've spoken about the three things: what is similar and what is different between the GFC and the CFC, India's response to COVID-19, and lessons from the crisis. I will stop there. Thank you very much. I've taken a little longer than the time allotted to me, but thank you for bearing with me. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Subbarao, and thank you very much for that excellent and lucid presentation. A moderator's job is very simple when he's overflooded with questions from the participants. So I must say that it's going to be a struggle for me to bring in as many questions to you as possible. So the first type of questions that I'm getting are on banks and NBFCs. You know, the RBI has allowed some moratorium, but there is still concern that the banks are already starting from a situation of kind of a weak position. So in that context, how do you think the banking system in India is going to react to this crisis? And in particular, there are lots of questions on whether the RBI is treating NBFCs differently from the banks, and should they also not be getting a similar kind of support? What kind of measures you can consider for them? So that is the first set of questions that I'm getting on the banks and the NBFCs' impact on them.
Thank you, Samiran. Those are very important questions. I wish I had answers for all of them. Yes, our bank started with very high levels of NPA, about 9 to 10%, even before the crisis hit us. And it's fairly certain that when we are through with this crisis, the level of NPAs will go up just because the financial distress will be so deep. Both large firms and small firms will be hit as a consequence. So it's certain that we will end this crisis with a significantly higher level of NPAs than we started it with. There is, what the government will have to do is to capitalize the banks. And it's very difficult, given all the fiscal constraints, to capitalize the banks even further, but there is no other solution to this. That banks will have to be capitalized so that they can withstand the level of NPAs. As the bankruptcy process should take care of some of the NPAs, the bankruptcy process has not been as rapid and effective as we thought, but hopefully all the legal issues, all the procedural issues, all the bureaucratic issues have been settled, and if the process gets on stream, we should be able to reduce the NPAs over the next, I wouldn't hesitate to put a time frame, but there is no easy solution to the NPA problem. As far as the NBFCs are concerned, they require support because at all times, particularly during a crisis, NBFCs provide valuable service. They go and lend where banks cannot or do not want to go. So it's very important that the central bank provides support to NBFCs. The question is whether they provide direct support or whether they provide support through the banking system. During the global financial crisis, for example, we established a line of credit for 2 banks to provide support to NBFCs. I recall that we also instituted a special purpose vehicle with IDBI to provide support to that special purpose vehicle with government guarantee, which in turn would lend to NBFCs. So RBI will certainly have to give some special support during the crisis time to NBFCs so that NBFCs in turn can support the small and medium firms as well as households. And what mechanism that has to take is we can borrow from the GFC experience, or because there's been a lot of experience since the GFC, RBI can tailor a separate instrumentality supporting the NBFCs.
Thank you, sir. I think the next bunch of questions are with respect to the labor market, the employment problem in India post the COVID situation. So what is your sense about the nature of this unemployment issue? How long is this going to last? Is this only going to be temporary? Is it going to be more structural? There are young participants in this webinar who have asked that what happens to them when they enter the job market this year? How do they prepare for it? So I'm just bringing all together to you.
No, thank you very much, Samiran. Yes, I can quite understand the concern of the youngsters who are entering the job market. But largely we're focused on the informal labor market, which is the biggest segment of our economy. And the informal labor segment is particularly hard hit because of the crisis. We saw on our television screens millions of people moving from the big cities back to their villages. Now they're stranded midway in different states, in different camps. The Prime Minister also spoke about it. The question is, what will happen to them? When will the construction sector, when will the informal economy open up so that they can get back to their livelihoods? That is a big uncertainty because nobody, as I said earlier in my presentation, as everyone is saying, there is the depth of uncertainty about this crisis is far too much for anybody to give a definitive answer. All we can hope is that this will be sooner rather than later, that the economy will open up. First, you know, when we restart the economy, I don't expect it will happen sector-wise. It'll happen supply chain-wise, because that's very important. As each sector is open, even if when it produces, it's very important that there is the supply chain available to move the production, move the product from the point of supply to the point of consumption. So it will happen that way. And as if you open the supply chain way, their jobs will open up, but they'll only open up gradually. They won't open up all of a sudden. As far as the formal sector is concerned, which is the matter of concern to the participants in this webinar, I'm sure that once the crisis is behind us, because of the resilience of India's economy, because of the resilience of our growth drivers, because of the strength of our consumption, because of the 1.3 billion people who are our consumption market, India has long-term growth potential. and there'll be jobs for all the youngsters from the formal sector.
Thank you, sir. Again, the third bunch of questions that I've understood, and I must tell you that the questions are running in hundreds, not in even dozens. So that is a difficult job for me. So apologies to everyone if I have not been able to take your question. This is impossible almost for me to take everything. So this question is about the monetary policy side of it. And there is 2-3 types of questions. One is about how much more rate cut can RBI do? Second is about this new liquidity provision windows like TLTRO, etc. How much do you think they will be effective in the current context where the banking system practically has become zombies and they don't want to lend anywhere? Does this liquidity provision at all help? And someone has actually asked you that is it the case that monetary policy is losing its power altogether? And the central bank, like the medicine companies, they're looking for a new vaccine. Should central bank be looking for a new policy toolkit altogether?
Okay, thank you, Samiran. Those are very important but difficult questions. About the rate cut, I expect, I think this question is in particular about India and about the RBI.
Yes.
On how much monetary policy room there is.
Yes.
I think the real policy rate is still positive. So there is still some room for the RBI to cut rates. The question is cutting rates necessary, and will cutting rates be effective? In fact, there are lots of people who said that even the rate cut that was affected end of March was unnecessary use of firepower, because as you said, Samiran, yourself, that as long as the monetary policy transmission is weak, what is the point of cutting rates? I checked with a few of my friends who dirty their hands with the numbers, and they've told me that the rate cut was affected by the RBI not so much as a stimulus measure, but as a measure to preserve financial stability, because without a rate cut, the banks will be squeezed, the cost of funds will be very high. The RBI was under pressure to reduce the cost of money for banks in order to preserve financial stability. So we have to give the benefit of the doubt to the RBI because they have more information from a variety of channels than all of us as individuals do. So to the extent that the RBI had done the rate cut, I think it was necessary, but I think they should be circumspect about for further rate cuts. They may not be as effective as the last rate cut was. In fact, the marginal impact of additional rate cuts might be lower. The second question is about the new liquidity provision and to what extent is the liquidity infusion effective. You know, pumping in liquidity is the most important thing. The first thing that central banks do in the event of a crisis. It's like when a patient who is collapsing goes to an ICU, in the emergency room, doctors give the patient oxygen, etc. Similarly, pumping in liquidity is the first thing that central banks do when there's a crisis situation. That's what central banks around the world have done. That's what RBI is doing. I think that is very necessary in order for the government to borrow, in order for banks to withstand this moratorium. So the RBI, by way of infusing liquidity, had cut the CRR, had allowed banks to access additional money under the marginal standing facility. I think those measures were very important. The liquidity infusion was important, much more important than the rate cut. The third question is a more philosophical question about whether central banks are losing their potency, whether they're losing their firepower, whether they're losing effectiveness. Now, the answer to that question spans the entire spectrum. There's one view which says that central banks can never ever lose their potency because they have the power to print money. As long as they have the power to print money, they will remain potent. The other extreme is that central banks can rapidly lose their potency, can lose their effectiveness if they run down their ammunition rapidly. And I myself am on the side of those who say that the central bank should be circumspect in using its firepower, because this is a very, very different crisis. As I said in my presentation, this is a crisis in the real economy that are transmitted to the financial sector. What is important is not to restore faith in the financial sector. What is more important is to restore faith in the real economy. So there is only so much central banks can do. There's only so much what central banks will do on restoring confidence in the real economy. So I think central banks should be very circumspect in using their firepower. They should be doing something, should be seen to be doing something, but they should be very careful.
So just kind of extending that conversation a bit. So one of the issues that everyone is discussing on that transmission of policy that you were talking of, that today the government bond yields are more than 200 basis points over the policy rate. The state governments have raised money close to 9%. Corporate bond yields have also been quite wide. What are your thoughts about RBI directly buying government bonds in a primary auction or in a private placement from the government? And also, is there a possibility that RBI can directly intervene in the corporate bond market as well? Does the RBI Act allow the RBI such powers to intervene?
Yeah, on the first question about government, RBI buying government debt in the primary market. You know, we were doing that before. All of you youngsters, you may not remember, but people old enough like me remember that before the 1991 reforms, the RBI was certainly, in fact, the government was ordering the RBI to buy its debt, in effect, lend to it. So the government used to say, this is our budget, this is the deficit, this deficit will be financed by the RBI. So as part of the 1991 reforms, we'd gotten away from that. That was a very, very important reform. And it restored credibility to the RBI. It restored credibility to our financial markets. It restored credibility to our economy. So we should be very cautious about deviating from that. Yes, I understand that there is a provision in the, I think it's the, which act I do not know. There is a provision, the FRBM Act perhaps, there is a provision for RBI to directly finance the government through the primary issue. There are some people who said that should be done. I'm not aware of the entire situation today. I'm not aware of the liquidity situation, like you, Samiran, said about the spreads, etc. But I would think that because this is such an exceptional situation, because this is such a deep crisis, this is a time, if at all, to invoke that exceptional provision and for the RBI to directly buy government debt in the primary market. As far as corporate bonds are concerned, you know, a lot of orthodox central banks do not do that. But there are central banks which do buy corporate bonds, like the Federal Reserve, for example, buys, mortgage-backed securities. They're buying corporate debt. They're buying corporate bonds. They're in fact buying junk bonds. They're buying bonds issued by municipalities, by county governments, by American state governments, etc. So the Federal Reserve has had a long history of buying not just treasuries, but corporate bonds and bonds of subnational governments. In India, the Reserve Bank has so far restricted itself to buying G-SECs. Again, this will be a very important important, what should I say, initiative or important policy measure that the RBI will be taking, that they'll be buying corporate bonds. But I think that should be done after a lot of deliberation and as an exceptional measure, after exhausting all other options available. As I said in my presentation, and as I said in response to an earlier question, there are other options available to the RBI to provide support to NBFCs and to provide support to the corporates, and they must be tried out before RBI directly buying corporate bonds.
So a question on similar lines is that today world over, and this is just not India, everywhere, there is a tendency of exploding of public debt. And in certain cases, there is monetization of debt as well. What in your view should be setting the limit for how much public debt can expand up to, and to what extent that can be monetized? And if I may add in that same question, that in the Indian context, this kind of explosion of public debt that we are foreseeing now with the 10% plus fiscal deficit, what happens to India's sovereign ratings? How would the rating agencies be viewing us now?
No, thank you. Thank you, Samiran. That's a very important question. And I think we should be talking about more in terms of fiscal deficit than the stock of debt. As I said in my presentation, there is pressure on the government to spend more, even if it means taking fiscal deficits to an unprecedented limit, because they show other countries that are spending. They show the US, which is spending, as I said, excuse me, 8% of GDP, Britain is spending, European countries are spending, Japan is spending, other countries are spending, etc. But as I said again in my presentation, we have to be conscious of our own circumstances. Our fiscal was already stretched even as we entered the corona financial crisis. On top of that, there is loss of revenue. And just because of the loss of revenue, the combined fiscal deficit of the center and states will be higher than 10% of GDP, and that's quite a lot. And if fiscal deficit is at that level, the adverse consequences can be significant. For example, the interest levels can go up, and private investment can be crowded out. There can be pressure on the rupee. Exchange rate can get volatile. There can be inflation pressures down the line. You might think that we're very comfortable right now with inflation, but there can be pressures. And as you said, Samiran, yourself, there is the issue of whether there can be a sovereign debt downgrade, a credit rating downgrade, because these investment houses have certain allocation for investment grade, and if our rating goes down, they'll pull out of India, and there'll be an exodus of capital out of India that will destabilize the exchange rate. So we should be very conscious of the adverse consequences of going overboard with fiscal deficit. So the question is, how much can we afford to spend? You know, I've been on several WhatsApp groups with the people, analysts talking about this. There's one view that the government should do what's called blue sky financing, not worry about the level of fiscal deficit at all, just determine what is the amount necessary to be spent, borrow to that extent, spend as if there is no fiscal constraint at all. The other view is that no, we cannot afford to do that because we're not a rich country. We're not America. America can afford to do that. America can afford to throw the kitchen sink at the crisis. America issues the dollar, which is a hard currency. America does not have a fiscal constraint. We're not America. We should be conscious of that. So we should set a limit, maybe 2% or 3% of GDP, and tailor our expenditure to that limit, because that will give a shared understanding, accountability to the government, put a limit to the expenditure, and give a shared understanding to the market and reassurance to the market onto the rating agencies.
And just if I may slip in a small thing there, I know you have talked about it a little in your presentation also, but if you have that space of only 2-3% of GDP, what should the government prioritize spending on? Is it, we all understand the health and the humanitarian part of the spending, but beyond that, from a stimulus perspective to the economy, what kind of a stimulus you would be asking for? Some people have said that you should be reappointed as in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and you should give your suggestion as if you were in that Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council.
Thank you very much. I want to say that there's enormous talent in the country. Even if I'm not advising the Prime Minister, I'm sure that he's getting very competent advice. But as far as the expenditure is concerned, Samiran, you mentioned the priorities. The first is expanding and improving the medical and health infrastructure. The second is support the livelihoods. Again, as I said, it cannot be an open-ended support. It's got to be limits given our fiscal constraints. The third is stimulus. There's got to be two types of things that the government must be spending on. One is to put money in the hands of households so that they will spend because we want demand in the economy. But we also need to put money in the hands of our firms, our large corporates, as well as the small and medium enterprises, so that they produce. So we have to make sure that both on the supply and demand side, there is balance, because if there's an imbalance between supply and demand, we'll get into problems once again. So on the demand side, it's fairly straightforward. We've got to put money in the hands of the people, rural sector, urban sector, and that there's ways of doing that. But as far as the firms are concerned, one thing the government can do from the additional fiscal allocation is to pay all its dues that it owes to the private corporates. I believe that the amount that the government and the public enterprises owe to the private corporate sector is significant. If the government pays that to the large corporates and mandates the large corporates in turn to pay up their medium and small enterprises who are their suppliers, cash will come into the hands of the corporates as well as the small and medium enterprises. I'm conscious that that alone will not be sufficient. Banks will have to be enjoined, will have to be encouraged, will have to be pressured to lend to corporates and to SMEs. But banks will be very scared, or I would say diffident about lending given all the NPA levels, etc. So in order to encourage banks to lend, the government will have to give guarantee. So the government, the second thing the government will have to do is to stand guarantee for the loans that the banks give to private enterprises. The third thing government has to do is through a program like the TARP of America during the global financial crisis, the Troubled Assets Reconstruction Program, which is to give capital support to financial institutions as well as non-financial institutions to raise capital. So government should be giving capital support. So three things that the government must be doing to support the private sector is to pay up their dues. Second, give guarantees for the loans that the banks give. Third is to give capital support.
Thank you, sir. That was very, very precise. One other sort of question I'm getting, and this is quite interesting also, is that while we are talking about stimulus, we are talking about monetization of deficit, which could be inflationary, but at the same time, we are talking of huge demand destruction, which could be deflationary. So in this debate about whether we are going to enter a period of stagflation or are we going to enter a period of deflation, what will be your view?
No, I don't think there'll be deflation in the country. You remember, even after the global financial crisis, we had a very, very brief period of disinflation, actually. In fact, deflation. So there were worries that we might get into stagflation or a deflationary situation, and that can be very, very alarming. But given the huge population, given that the government will be extending livelihood support, I don't think India should be worrying about a deflationary trend. On the other hand, inflation is always a concern. If there's monetization of debt, if there is so much of liquidity sloshing around in the system, if the government puts money in the hands of the informal sector, there could be a situation where the demand might exceed the available supply, and we could enter an inflationary situation. So I would imagine that an inflationary situation is more probable, much more probable than a deflationary situation, given the amount of fiscal deficit and the amount of additional fiscal deficit there will be in the system. Stagflation, yes, it is a possibility if growth does not pick up soon enough. But again, one of the uniquely positive things about India, which sets it apart from the rest of the world, from the rich countries, indeed even from other emerging economies, is our huge consumption base. So as long as we have the consumption base, that's a huge growth driver for us. We can capitalize on that. And as much as stagflation is a possibility, it's possible, but not probable.
Slightly shifting gears, a lot of questions around this issue about reverse globalization. Will this event lead to more protectionist tendencies? Is there a possibility that the world will treat China differently, and China will not be the manufacturing hub of the world anymore? Things will shift to India, etc. How do you look at this whole process?
Well, you could write an entire thesis on that, because there have been lots of discussion, very learned discussion, informed discussion about whether globalization is receding, whether there is a wave of deglobalization. That discussion actually precedes the coronavirus, because of the Trump trade wars, because of protectionist tendencies, because of nationalist tendencies in Europe, across the world, etc. There was talk about whether we're entering a deglobalization wave. I personally believe that given the situation today, given how much the world has opened up, given how positive the impact of globalization has been on rich countries as well as emerging economies, deglobalization on a large scale is improbable. There is talk about it, I know, but when it comes to brass tacks, I'm hoping and I believe that better sense will prevail, and we will see that our collective advantage, global collective welfare, lies in our remaining globalized. Having said that, there are concerns that the coronavirus will be seen as a direct impact of globalization. After all, it spread from one country to another because of people moving, and movement of people, cross-border movement of people, is one of the important facets of globalization. But I would imagine that we will take that in our stride. There will be safeguards instituted to prevent or contain the spread of disease from one country to another across borders, just as we've done after the global financial crisis, after the 9/11 attacks, for example, not GFC, but after the 9/11 attacks, there were countries around the world had intensified cross-border checks for terrorism, cross-border movement of people, movement of money, movement of terrorists, a movement of armaments. Similarly, after this pandemic is behind us, countries will institute measures for preventing the transmission of disease from one country to another, but I don't see globalization going away.
And kind of one question which I constantly getting, and I was not intending initially to ask the question, but everyone is asking that what should we do to the currency? Should we let the rupee depreciate a lot? Would dollar become stronger and stronger globally after this kind of an event? Your views on this?
You know, actually, Samiran, you are in the thick of the market. You perhaps know better than I do. But because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the dominant reserve currency, and because this is a crisis situation, there is forming in of the capital around the world, which goes back to the home country. The dollar inevitably strengthens in times of crisis like this because it is the reserve currency. In fact, more than today, what happened during the global financial crisis was much more ironic, paradoxical, because America was the center of the global financial crisis, but dollar strengthened. Exactly the opposite should have happened. Dollar should have collapsed, but the dollar strengthened. Similarly, the dollar is strengthening today because there's a crisis situation. But as the crisis eases, I think the dollar will come back to an equilibrium level, will lose some of its strength, and emerging economic currencies, including the rupee, will consequently appreciate. What the Reserve Bank should do in the interregnum, there are very many views. The Reserve Bank's standard policy, which they say repeatedly, is that they only manage volatility. They do not target a specific exchange rate. But what is volatility is not defined, has never been defined. So whatever the Reserve Bank does, whether they're intervening in the currency market to build reserves, whether they're intervening in the currency market to target a specific exchange rate, it can always be interpreted or explained away as saying that the Reserve Bank is intervening in the market, excuse me, to manage volatility. So my own view, which I have in fact said in my book, is that the Reserve Bank should err on the side of not intervening to the extent possible. Should let the exchange rate float and intervene only as an exceptional measure and not as a normal measure. Because once the Reserve Bank starts intervening every time there's a movement in the currency, corporates and banks will outsource their exchange rate management to the Reserve Bank, and the currency can be gamed. So in order to prevent that possibility, the Reserve Bank should intervene in the currency markets only as an exceptional situation, not as a routine situation.
I'm very conscious of time, so I'm just going to ask you two last questions. One is about a question about what kind of social behavioral changes do you expect? And kind of connected to it is that while we are talking about dealing with the crisis, in your view, are there any specific opportunities that could be opening up for companies, businesses in India post this crisis, which you would particularly like to talk about?
You know, about what sort of social changes will come up, I thought I had, in fact, given the thought experiment. So all the hundreds of participants on this webinar can think about it themselves. I think there will be some changes in our society, in our communities, in our households. For us personally, we'll be more conscious of public health. We'll be more conscious of hygiene, not just us who are fortunate to be in relatively middle or high income groups, but even the low income groups in the country, which is very, very important. Even they will not go back to the original situation. There'll be much greater consciousness of hygiene. And the government will spend more on public health rather than on tertiary and secondary care. I think that will be an important trend. The other thing we've spoken about earlier, countries will be instituting checks at border posts about the movement of people, infectious diseases. We'll be more conscious about crowding. We'll be more conscious about our trains and our buses, our public transport systems. I think there's nothing that can be done in the short term, but I think we'll be conscious about that. What the second part of that question? I slipped that.
So it was about the opportunities that can come out of this crisis. Which are the industries which might actually turn out to be better post this crisis?
Well, certainly, as I said, if you are into contact tracing, onto surveillance, there will be opportunities there, but I hope they'll be used in a very healthy way, in a very positive way, and will not be used in a way that encroaches on, intrudes into our lives and our lifestyles. But I see opportunities in the public health sector. I see opportunities for everything that goes into preventive healthcare.
And one last question that I have is about what are you reading during this lockdown? And with a lot of young participants in this webinar, what is your suggestion for them to read?
Well, I should tell youngsters to read books that will be mood elevating, But I personally am reading at the moment Paul Krugman's Return to Depression Economics. Not because I want to crowd myself with more depression, but I just thought that I should refresh my memory with depression economics. So I'm reading that book. I would advise youngsters to read that book because it's a short book, fascinating book. If you just give me a minute, I will see it in the cover right here. Right. Yes, it is this one. I hope you can see it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So this is a good book, short book. So it's worth reading to understand the global situation.
Thank you so much for that, sir. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar. I think the organizers have shared a feedback form with all the attendees. So it will be great if you can fill it up once this session is over. Thank you, Dr. Subbarao, again for this exciting discussion. I know this is a topic which we could have gone on and on. It's top of everyone's mind. We might at some point of time get bored by the amount of discussion we are having on this virus, but that's just the times. We will probably have the another opportunity to discuss with you later on how things are progressing. But once again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bring this to a close here. Thank you again.
Take care and keep safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.